To my left, to your right, Joe Haldeman and Alistair Reynolds. So, and oh, here's Greg Bendford coming in. Late but not too late. And
just in time.
Exactly. So we are here to discuss the topic reclaiming the solar system, which it might be a title that doesn't have a whole lot of necessarily literary truth to it, but I need that out. But it's okay because it at least gets us started as a good talking point, and I think it is at least possible to postulate that between near future science fiction, which being near future is kind of necessarily mostly on Earth or close to Earth, and space opera, which very often is out there in the great beyond one way or another, that there is this zone in between in both space and time that's somewhat difficult or a little underpopulated relative to the others. Maybe because it's a little bit harder to write about. We'll have to discuss that. But it's really missing an opportunity that is a very grand one, because our neighborhood, the solar system, is filled with beautiful and startling and potentially human places. And we know more about it than we ever have before because of these superb robotic probes that have been going out and sending back pictures that are in high def, that when you're used to the Viking lander photos like I am, like 10 years of looking at Viking data, anything that comes nowadays is just so high definition that it's like having an hallucination. It's great. And so here it is, and we notice that Al Reynolds is a representative of a whole group, I know, of his Brit colleagues who have been doing this, amongst them also Paul McCauley, I think, would be one to point to, who is using the solar system as a fantastic story space, but they are just the beginning of it. So maybe we can start with Al, and then we'll just kind of bounce around amongst my worthy constituaries, as Charlie Parker said of Dizzy Gillespie, and we'll see what people have to say about the various parts of this. And as we get through the hour, let us not omit any of the great neighbors that we have for their human potential. So Al, why don't you start, and then we'll just go on down through.
Well, I would sort of slightly question the premise of the topic, I suppose, because when I started connecting with science fiction in sort of 70s and 80s, there were always these fantastic books out that you might loosely say were sort of tour of the solar system books, where the adventure would take you from one planet to the other, and you'd get a sort of perspective based on the then credible state of the science, be it the very fuzzy Voyager pictures. You know, you can go back to The Memory of Whiteness, for instance. Mr. Robinson's one of his very early novels, a book which I really had a big impact on me as a reader in the early 80s. Against Infinity by Mr. Bendford, Joe's World Sequence, and then in the sort of when the sort of cyberpunk downburst, you had things like Vacuum Flowers by Swanwick, you had Schismatrix by Bruce Sterling. You know, books that really got to grips with the solar system as it then was. And then on into the 90s, we have the Mars sequence. And yeah, there is a little uptick in it now with you know, again, my colleague Paul McCauley has done the whole sequence of novels dealing with a realistically conceived solar system. We have Stan's 2312. But I don't think it ever went away. There may be a little bit more of it. Perhaps the recent slew of, as you say, HD images is sort of giving a little bit of a sort of a catalyst to the imagination to some writers. But I think that little subgenre has always been there and probably always will be there.
Joe?
Well, I would say this panel really appealed to me because the very first book I read in my life was Rocket Jockey by Philip St. John, which is Lester Del Rey. And it was about a sort of Grand Prix among the solar system where guys with rockets that were basically just jalopies would go, they had to touch every planet and get back to Earth, and the one that got back to Earth first just make zillions of dollars.
Microphone?
For a 9-year-old.
Pull that microphone.
Oh, for a 9-year-old, that's just a perfect story. It was great.
How did they touch Jupiter?
Well, that was before 2000. was Jupiter.
Greg?
I was thinking about that era. Lester mentioned, that's actually why I wrote The Martian Race, which was my way of saying that I intuited that we were about to go back into the solar system, not just as explorers, but as exploiters. And so The Martian Race is about a scenario that actually was proposed occasionally in both Congress and NASA, that if you really want to send an expedition to Mars, you copy the British method of the 17th and 18th century. You set up a prize. Said, we heard of this place called Bangkok. Somebody go there. You come back with a hole full of all this exotic stuff, and we'll give you this prize. And that way, we don't spend anything until you survive. And NASA and the other large space agencies do that, and then the big spacecraft blows up on the test stand and kills some astronauts in Florida, and doesn't look like anybody's going to do it, but the prize is still there. So a guy closely modeled on Ted Turner, you complete with a southern accent, puts up $5 or $6 billion, buys some NASA equipment, sends people on a manned expedition. They stay there on the minimum energy orbit, and then the Chinese appear with a nuclear rocket. It's an interesting book. The point is that, let's look at the history of the United States. At the same time, John Muir was beginning to explore Yosemite and the High Sierras, which I spent the summer living in this year. Leland Stanford was building the railroad that brought people to see them. So I think the exploration of the solar system will proceed in that manner because there are things to be done, asteroid mining, some other enterprises, and that will tend to give us the infrastructure to push things outward. And your novel, Antarctica, is really about a continent that didn't get explored very much, except for the first visits, until the United States and others built the naval apparatus and the aircraft that could take you there in large numbers. So I think we're beginning to open up the solar system in that way too, not just exploratory robots, but there will be economics, and there will be something like frontiers that will make the whole world more wealthy. And that's going to go in hand. And I like that kind of, the idea of trying to depict a future in which you have all the beauties and you also have all the human element of trying to expand human horizons in one. And I think this century is going to see that happen, and it's going to be a qualitative change from the last century. And that, to me, is narratively interesting, and I intend to get back to the subject as soon as I finish the novel I'm working on right now.
Well, let's think about novels set in the solar system, because they've got to present certain problems. And here's one of them I want to propose to you, is that to plausibly suggest that we're zipping around the solar system where distances are pretty big, not interstellar distances, thank God, but pretty big, means that you're necessarily putting your story a century or 2 centuries or 3 centuries out from now, so that we've got the technologies to make it plausible. Because one of the things I want to suggest is that the solar system science fiction is a kind of realism, in that you don't have to invoke magical abilities to get there. And you tend to do it in the next few centuries so that there's still a historical connection to now. Well, this is interesting in 2 or 3 different ways, but it sets up problems too, in that then you have to do a future history. And I'm going to say that there's near-future science fiction, there's space opera, and in between, in this zone we're discussing today, is the future history. Taking it from Heinlein's notion that you can tack in a whole bunch of different narratives into your future history, but what I'm saying is that it goes further than just day after tomorrow, which is near future, and yet it doesn't go the millions of years out of space opera to the indefinite future. It's actually historical. You're saying, hey, 300 years, so then you have to talk about what happens in 300 years. That's a pretty long time, and you've only got a novel. So now all of you have done novels in this, and so talk a little bit about the kind of stories that you end up telling. And let's do the same thing. Al, go tell us about the kind of stories you're doing in the solar system, and then Joe and Greg.
Well, I did 10 novels which were sort of out there, generally speaking, in the universe with near-light relativistic starships zipping off to Epsilon Eridani, you know, and all that stuff. After I visited Kennedy Space Center in 2008, I had a kind of epiphany that I wanted to kind of press the reset button on my SF in a way and get back to the nuts and bolts of plausible space exploration, stressing the difficulties, the fact that, you know, even things in the solar system are a long way away. The environment is very hostile, but also the potential, the beauty, the wonder of actually setting foot on another planet. But as Stan says, you then immediately start thinking about the realistic mechanics of it, the sort of the future historical question of how you get from here to there. And for me, it's also very intuitive. And I was listening to a lot of West African music at the time, and I started sort of thinking, if I'm going to do this trilogy about space exploration, why not move the sort of geopolitical focus of my future as well, rather than have the sort of the West versus China or the West versus the Soviet Union? Why not have Africa as the sort of engine that's driving this space program? So that for me was an interesting sort of, it felt like I was doing something that at least felt interesting to myself. And that became at least as interesting as thinking about the mechanics of the fusion rockets and how, you know, how do they actually get to Mars, how many days does it take? So, you know, it was sort of like a melting pot of different sort of ideas stirring around in there. But it also felt, I wanted to get back to a type of science fiction, which I would say sort of almost in the sort of Clarkian mode, where there are no villains as such, there's no sort of high melodrama, but space itself is enough of an adversary. It's an environment that's going to kill you if you give it half a chance. And that in enough is enough of a motor for the story. I mean, I remember reading sort of Clark's novels where at the end of the chapter, I just couldn't wait to get to the next chapter, even though there was no, you know, there were no sort of explosions, there were no sort of cosmic conspiracy. There was enough of a plot motor to pull me through the story. And I thought, I'd really like to kind of try and get back to that in my own science fiction.
That's neat, because that suggests that really it's a kind of nature fiction, which I like myself. I mean, it makes you think about maybe Jack London, you know, the human struggling in nature, and that the solar system then becomes like, okay, it's nature. It's still the neighborhood.
Well, there's that fantastic scene in, forgive me, but I forget which of the Mars books it is, but where there's that enormous sort of avalanche/flood with huge boulders, and you know, the little rover is almost caught up in. And that's just pure nature versus human frailty, and it's just gripping.
Yeah. Joe?
A neat thing about working in this regime is that you don't require any fundamental new discoveries in physics or fundamental new applications in engineering. And we can go there. You know, we could do it now. We can actually put a story there without changing physics in any revolutionary way. I'm writing a story now, a novel now, called Phobos Means Fear. And basically the MacGuffin in here is they had a pretty heavy ship being assembled in orbit. It was going to land on Mars, the factory that would build, you know, slowly accumulate water and oxygen and so forth that would allow them to make a Mars base. And it was a 10, 15-year long thing that they're going to do, which is right off the drawing boards now. But then something goes terribly wrong. And, you know, that's the basic plot of many a story. But the fun part of this was I could do all this research about Phobos, about Mars, and keep one foot right here and make it realistic in that sense. And for the sake, similarly, the social conditions on Earth are not that alien, so you can do a lot of very direct comment on Earth politics and war age and so forth. It's just a really fun place to write. Granted, the novel that I write probably will look pretty old-fashioned in about 15 or 20 years. But I care.
No. Phobos is a great story space. Many of you might not remember that it is so low to the planet that in the high northern and southern hemispheres on Mars, you can't even see it. It's under the horizon, like a high-flying airplane or something. And that's so strange and bizarre. You've got to go there. Right?
And Demos means
dread.
Dread or fear.
this week, he's published a book called Starship Century, which ended it, but has a novella in it called The Man Who Sold the Stars. And it covers this whole next century from the point of view of an entrepreneur who slowly pushes out into the solar system robots, 3D printing, nuclear thermal rockets, and so forth, to not only just go out and mine asteroids, things like that, but they find new, as we would say, business models for moving into the solar system. For example, if you want to have volatile materials like water, CO2, and so forth, they're available free in cometary nuclei that occasionally fall in this way, so there's a bit of capturing available there. Little things like that. And it ends up with him actually managing to take part in the first interstellar expedition, which is to a brown dwarf that's not really very far away. You may not have noticed that the second closest star to our sun was discovered this year by the infrared telescope WISE, that's an acronym, which in their data analysis, and they have millions of points to look at still, they suddenly realized this thing is only about 6 light years away. It's been there all the time. We just didn't see it visibly because it's mostly an infrared object, brown dwarf. So this guy realizes that every time you open a new spectral window on the heavens, you find out new stuff. And that's probably going to be true in the solar system, too. There's going to be stuff that we didn't know was there. Look at NASA's problems right now trying to find a small enough Volkswagen-sized asteroid to go snag. They'll probably find it. So, to me, these are dramas of exploration. But they have a purpose. I mean, there's something there that will inevitably be used in some fashion. But also is a gift of wonder. I mean, I'd really like to see what Ceres looks like, for example, the largest asteroid. And what's it like to be there? And I've forgotten how much it takes, but a plausible athlete like Stan could probably jump off Ceres. Not quite, but I'm talking about Stan, maybe young Stan. Could jump off it, and but in any case, I mean, so what a thrill it would be to jump, say, a kilometer off the surface of an asteroid and go back down. I mean, there's a whole new Olympic event right there. Well, we're going to find all kinds of stuff like that. That's why I like your story about baseball on Mars. Yeah. Because you can still play baseball, but it's going to have a very big diamond for 0.38 Gs. I noticed you didn't write the baseball on the moon story because then you can't even see third or second base.
That would be GPS baseball. That's not a good idea.
No. So there are all these fun things that are going to happen too. You know, and I like putting in that kind of element in the story, because you will always find that people, particularly those out in lonely, distant places like you know, the High Sierras 100 or more years ago, or asteroids or Mars, they're going to find something that's fun to do. And finding a new fun thing to do is a lot of, it's a thrill, really. I was a grad student at UCSD back in the early 60s. You were in the 1970s, late 70s, yeah. And we're part of the 4 of us who got PhDs in UCSD and became, despite the efforts of the faculty, science fiction writers. Me, and then Vernon Vinci, and then David Brennan, and now Stan. And they were, Hugh Bragner, whom you may not have known, had just helped invent the first wetsuit for oceanographic purposes. He wanted to patent. UCSD wisely said, "Are you kidding? How many oceanographers are there in the world? Nobody's going to be making use of this. This is not worth patenting." And that's how UC lost $500 million by lack of imagination. So there are examples there, and having the cleverness to think of those kinds of things is what makes stories work.
Device for imaginative fiction 50 years ago. And that was so fun because, you know, you just make up a the science. He's just got to be consistent with the story itself.
So if you were a sort of conscientious science fiction writer in the 20s, you would have turned to, was it Svante Arrhenius, the great chemist?
Yeah.
You know, there's this quote where he says, "The surface of Venus is no doubt composed mainly of swamps." I think, okay, that's what the great man tells me, so
Well, in fact,
off I go and do my swamp story.
I have a small library of old astronomy books, and I found one that was sort of crumbling, an old leather-bound volume, which had a long description of what Venus looks like.
I mean, Mars fiction is intensely responsive to the contemporary science about Mars, starting with the ship-related role and going on from there. And Venus, I mean, it's a great idea for an anthology, but we have to admit that the wonderful Roger Zelazny played both these games in his great duo, Doors with a Space Lancer, and then Rose for Ecclesiastes, saying goodbye to the old Mars pieces. But you never have to say goodbye in these scenarios, because now that we have steampunk, the whole idea of recycling our ancient ideas or going back into the past and turning it into science fiction is a very common thing to do, very fun. And actually, when you read 19th century fiction, you realize that steampunk was already contemporarily there, so it's not that much of a retro thing to do. I wonder also about you guys. My three co-panelists can do things that I can't do in terms of actually using real physics to make plot developments and have things happen because of the physics of the situation, which I've admired hugely in all three of their work at various points along the way, and I'm very envious because as an English major, all I can do is, well, I used to call Charles Sheffield and say, "Charles, I need help." And now I can't do that anymore, sadly, but I will call Chris McKay at NASA, but it isn't the same as being able to tweak your own plots, doing your own calculations. And so the solar system's pretty good for that, I should think.
That's true. I mean, yeah, it reminds me, in the Martian Race, I actually got from NASA their orbital charts for when you can launch from Mars for the time period I wanted, which was about 20 years from now. So, I mean, they actually made it up for me. I just, it's free. But I checked the calculations too. So,
I asked Greg for help back in the very early 90s on the space elevator. Like once you take the rock off the top of the space elevator on Mars, which way does it fall? And he said, I asked Charles Sheffield, that was really alarming, Charles, at a certain point. At first I said, how much would you have to slow down folks to bring it down? That's a terrible thought. And then like a year later, how much would you have to speed up Deimos to get Deimos out of the Martian system? You're working Mars.
It is fun to fool around with new problems.
To do the calculations.
Right. I actually took an example like that and put it on the PhD qualifying exam at UC, just for fun, and about half the people got it right.
I often ask Chris McKay of NASA Ames questions like this, and sometimes he'll send back the answers, and it'll be like an X over Y equals an A. It's like, and he says it back without much commentary, like, even you should know this. Rocket science is not always rocket science.
All this sort of, it's a bit of a double-edged sword, I find, because when I was doing Who Remembered Earth, I wanted to get the relative positions of the planets correct to the epoch of the book, because I wanted to be able to say, okay, now's a good time to go to Mars. So I got a bit of software, which was some freeware, and you can sort of play around with it. And I found, okay, here's a point where it would be very easy for the characters to get from Earth to Mars in the shortest possible time. Fine. So that was the date of my novel, the start of the action. And I'm happily writing it, and I had a scene where I've just got two characters, and one of them looks up at the full moon from Africa. And I sort of carried on for a bit. I thought, hang on, this is checkable. Yeah. And if I don't get it right, someone's going to check it. Now, how the hell do I then check whether the full moon is visible on a given date in 150? Well, you can use the same software, but it sort of adds a sort of whole burden of additional stuff you've got to get right. Whereas if you're writing something set in the Earth 30 billion, you don't worry about it.
they're not going to check it. Now,
Something I didn't know until I wrote this last story. Of course, you can check ephemerides and you find out when the full moon is up to 250 years from now. No problem. But try to do it with phobos and deimos. Nobody has compiled those charts. So you either haul out your different equations or you just close your eyes and touch it.
I do a lot of blind typing myself. Now, I want to open it up to questions, but while we're doing the questions, think about, let's make sure that we mention kind of a favorite place in the solar system that you'd like to go, that you'd like to write about, or have written about, and so that we can just give, that isn't just the obvious stuff, like, let's not have Olympus Mons or whatever. Let's think about some corners, and then let's take questions and go see what people want to have us talk about. Yes?
This starts with a bit of a story. Is anyone, you were talking about Antarctica earlier as an analogy, the exploration of Antarctica. And we all know who were the first two people to get there. Are the panel aware of who was the third in the 1950s? Is anyone in the room aware of who was third and how he got there?
Do you mean the South Pole?
To the South Pole.
Yeah.
It was actually Sir Edmund Hillary. And he went there on a bunch of Massey Ferguson tractors, modified farm tractors. Would the panel care to speculate what would be the equivalent of those tractors exploring the solar system?
I think instead of old tractors, you need old money.
To practice for that trip, the Sir Edmund Hillary was zooming around the bottom end of Ross Island, and he whips out aptly Cherry Garrard's The Worst Journey in the World, which recounts Cherry Garrard, Bowers, and Wilson hiking in dead of winter across the south end of Ross Island to Cape Crozier to pick up some emperor penguin eggs so that you could prove that ontogeny replaces phylogeny, which it does not. And so they made a rock hut at Cape Crozier that they had to abandon in the midst of the winter. And this is all entirely at about 80 degrees below Fahrenheit, lost their tent, managed to get back, etc., etc. Hillary reads the book, and from the accuracy of Cherry Garrard's description, was able to relocate the rock hut and find about 120 articles that the three guys hadn't found in the dark in their quick escape. It's all now in the Christchurch Museum, including one of the emperor penguin eggs that they hadn't brought in, and a thermos that would have been incredibly useful. So that they obviously missed that in their hurry. It's a very strange story. Yes?
We don't have a lot of fiction regarding Uranus. What kind of stories would you like to set there? What's wrong with this planet?
Its name.
I started thinking about that about 3.5 minutes ago. And I think obviously one thing you have to come up with is a discovery between now and then of something that's absolutely vital that Uranus has, nobody else has. I don't know. It's got a name that, when mispronounced, is an automatic source of humor.
Yeah.
But other than that, what is the difference between Uranus and Neptune? I mean, in terms of resources and so forth, they're rather different in a telescope.
The one thing
I looked at both of them.
Yeah.
And they're, one is dim green, the other is dim blue.
Yeah.
And Neptune is a lot dimmer, but use a very telescope.
The thing to do there would be actually to go to Miranda, because the moon of Miranda, Uranus, is unique in the solar system, and it looks like two moons have collided into each other and stuck. And there are some canyons on that little moon that I just boggle on.
Yeah, that's true. Actually, there may be a resource, because I remember years ago reading a description of the atmospheres of both Uranus and Neptune that said there is a layer of probably fairly pure hydrogen at the top of the atmosphere. And therefore, you scoop in, you pick up a lot of free hydrogen, it's useful for this, that, and the other, and you do it with a Moran scoop vessel. So you just scoop in enough, you harvest this resource, and out you go again. And it's useful in nuclear reactors, things like that. So it's kind of like peeling the planet.
Good idea.
The fuel for a starship.
Now, speaking of seeing Neptune, once I went to Mount Wilson, and we were looking at the big old honking 19th century style telescope, and we trained it on Mars, and Mars was like, the astronomers were saying, well, this is like looking at the full moon on Earth. Mars is too close, Mars is too easy, and the Mount Wilson telescope is just blasting this orange light in our face, and I was thinking, Mars is too close. So they trained it on Triton. We were seeing perfect images of Neptune's moon Triton, so that was one amazing night. Other questions? Yes.
I was going to suggest, Miranda would be a great spot for your extreme sports suggestion.
Yes.
I don't think any rock climber on the planet could look at that picture of that cliff without wanting to do low-G rock climbing.
Oh yes, oh yes. It's a big. I forget the kilometers, but it dwarfs any other canyon, and yet it's a rather small moon, so it's got to be a fun place to go.
Yeah, I actually struck a story about ice skating in Ganymede, which you could do in a lot of moons, right? Ice skating in 0.09 G, things like that. So, and what would sport be like? And you could take enormous, long strides. And so it would fundamentally change the sport. And in fact, this whole analysis of how sports change when you change gravity and air pressure and all that has always been of interest to me. And so you could think of really, really strange things, like, how far can you jump across a chasm? Yes. And what are the consequences if you don't?
There's
YouTube.
Greg's comment brings to mind the workshopping statement that I always make to beginning science fiction writers who inevitably point out the implausibility of exactly what they are proposing is happening in the story, where some character helplessly blurts out that, oh, how unlikely this is, and the phrase is skate fast over thin ice. Yes?
It'd be interesting to hear if the panel thinks there's enough of a storyline and entertainment in the colonization of Mars, a la the Mars One effort, to form a reality TV show to fund the effort. Heard of Mars One?
Yeah. Right.
Well, Terry Bisson in Voyage to the Red Planet does something like that.
Yeah. Right.
But I would like to actually hear, I'm thinking this Mars One thing is just either a scam or a delusion, or one of those convenient delusions that allows the people doing it to think that it's real and yet it's actually a scam. In other words, they're never going to get there, and they're taking money from people to apply. So is am I right?
I don't think it's fundamentally dishonest. I think that if you ask people to give money and say, we have a few little details first, like how are we going to do it? That's clear enough in the proposal. Okay, I think that's the essence of venture capitalism. You don't know what you're going to get out of it, but it may be a whole new world of investment.
Yeah, Dave. And then Fred.
Okay. I just wanted to ask, there's ideas of where we should colonize and actually build a permanent habitation off-world. Should it be the moon? Should it be Mars? What are the advantages of either of those? Or
spin an asteroid, hollow it out, live inside. That's the old adage, coal and all kinds of ideas that are well over half a century old. That's a good thing to do. Mars is like the moon with bad weather. So I would like a place where you can adjust its centrifugal gravity, because we actually don't know what happens between 0 and 1G. I always wondered if maybe there's some kind of optimum that's between 0 and 1, and 1 is not optimal. We've evolved to it, but evolution's not interested after you've reproduced. You lose your ability to reproduce, the selection's gone, and you're discarded. But what if you change gravity and you live longer? I've always wondered about that. And the point, you just have a bunch of asteroid colonies, and you could just see what the mean lifespan looks like.
I think that would be one of the sort of big splitters in a way when we actually go out into the solar system. There'll be some of us who will insist on taking 1G with us for centrifuges and things, so we can feel.
There'll be traditionalists, fundamentalists.
There'll be people who say, no, to hell with it. We're living in space. Let's just throw away gravity. Maybe we have to live in microgravity environments. Right. Maybe we adapt to weightlessness.
Microgravity was really dangerous, though. Although I'm planning to buy, once the price comes down, a week in orbit in Bigelow's hotel, which they believe will be up in 2 to 3 years. Or at least Elon Musk told me that, and I believe it.
If you can't make it that week, Greg, for some reason,
it's got to be. He said, how much would it be? What's maybe the lowest possible you can envision, maybe within the next decade for a week in orbit? And he said $250,000, and I could afford that. And in fact, I'm going to make a tax deductible. So Joe.
I'm thinking about the totally unscientific but absolutely thrilling part of Albert Besser's The Stars My Destination, where there are people living in the asteroid belt who are living in like 0.001 G. And gravity just isn't there at all. Now, Alfie didn't know much about science. And that makes it really interesting because these people can be in a zero gravity thing like a spaceship wreck, and they go through zero gravity and junk follows them like the tail of a comet. You stop, pick up the stuff, and you go off in the other direction, and the stuff follows you again. God knows what Alfie thought. was bringing this garbage in.
Personal gravity, right?
Yeah, personal gravity.
Oh, you didn't think it was kind of your jet stream effect?
Yes, in the front.
I was just thinking, too, to add to the ideas about the sports, you could have like a solar wind sailing contest tied in with the slingshot effect around the planets, and they got to get their timing just right.
Oh, yeah.
So you're not limited to just the solar body.
Space jockey. That has a long and honorable tradition in science fiction, and space jammers. Well,
and the NASA mission to fly out and to provide us with an early warning system beyond the L1 point to fly next year, made by the way, is called Sunjammer.
Well, there's some great, and the retro science fiction about the solar system that no longer exists. The Bright Side Crossing about Mercury. I've been very interested in Mercury, and it seems to me to be a spectacular human location, despite its difficulties. And now that we know that it's rolling ever so slowly, I mean, I've put that to use now for 35 years, and it's a lot of fun to contemplate. Other questions? Yes.
So, I sort of wonder if sometimes you guys have experiences where the modern science ends up sort of bogging you guys down. Or is it possible to know too much so that, I'm sort of thinking about, that there's a lot of literature about exploring Africa back during the Victorian age, and then as we learn more about it, it's sort of all petered out.
I don't think you can know too much, but I think you can think too much.
I think that when you have these imaginative landscapes that you haven't yet colonized and set stories in them, and there's always that process will always be driving us further and further out because there's no undiscovered continents on the Earth anymore. And we now know more and more about the solar system. And to some extent, that's why my theory is that there's always a tendency to break the frame of a novel set within the solar system. Countless examples end with the discovery of the means to achieve interstellar travel. So the subtext is always that the solar system is a bit of a prison. It's not room enough for sort of human destiny. So I think that there's always going to be that push outwards to keep claiming new territory for the imagination. Arrakis is basically Mars, isn't it? But it's Mars unfettered by Mariner. It's the Mars of the imagination, but transplanted a few hundred light years out of the solar system.
Now, maybe we have time for one more question, and then let's remember some of these favorite places before we end, because we are coming near the end, and if there's another question, we'll take that, and then maybe we are are to that moment, right? Favorite places. So give us a solar system spot. Oh wait, one more question.
Favorite place.
Oh, well, go ahead. What is it?
Titan. It's the one of Saturn. It has understood pressure, pretty much similar to what we have. It's mostly nitrogen. And I think if you attach wings to your hand, because of the low gravity, it's 0.14 G, you can actually fly.
Yes.
But it's pretty cool.
Yes. For those of you who couldn't hear that, Titan is a suggestion for its atmosphere, its livability.
Yeah, you just took away my favorite place. Again, that's true. You can really fly very well. Because you can fly on the moon, too.
Yeah.
Well, you enclose the volume and, minutes from Earth, high line.
Okay, how about the Oort cloud? The very, very farthest edge of the solar system, which is also the edge of interstellar space. Talking about plots, I want a race of human beings genetically modified so that they can live there for hundreds of thousands of years. And they are bred to be the first people to encounter other races. That's all they live for, and they've lost contact with Earth. The old starship story where people forget that they're in a starship and they build up a new civilization with odd paradigms. Well, I get to see that being, these people, I mean, they're rebred or remanufactured to have a maximum ability to use the extremely scarce resources way out there. And their lives are extremely slow. I mean, one action takes years and so forth, but you have a lot of them, and their total accomplishments are things that take centuries and centuries to do, but that's okay because all they have to do is wait for that one time, thousands of years hence, when something comes into that space. I think that would be a beautiful, mysterious kind of story. In fact, maybe it should be a film of the story.
Folks, you heard it here first. Keep it ideal.
A slow life.
Yeah. What do you think, guys? Al, Greg, favorite place? Suggestion?
I've always liked the idea of Jupiter and the Galilean satellites as a kind of solar system within the solar system. I'd love to write a book that went no further than just the moons of Jupiter. To some extent, that's Galileo's dream, isn't it? Because you created this.
I got heavily distracted, however.
Yeah.
I think that it didn't really do justice, but those four moons being so different, and Jupiter produces a wicked radiation.
It is, but my favorite place is what I call the realm of the sky of ice. Below the ice on, say, Europa, and whatever being you are, whatever frequency you look in, or maybe it's an acoustic wave you're using, you look up, and way up there's a sky of ice, a solid sky, and you are living in what they will think of as molten ice. Right? They're living in molten ice, and here's a sky of ice, a solid sky. Think about the conceptual worldview of an alien creature, of course, in which it's the opposite of our case. You look up and you see the whole universe. They look up and see confinement, and of course, solid separations below. So they are trapped between two spheres. And what does that make you into? What kind of a creature are you?
But philosophically, they wouldn't be any different from people who lived prior to Copernicus. I mean, they thought the sky was solid under them. They had the solid Earth.
Well, some people did.
But to the extent I did.
But notice that they would think things like streaking, comets would appear and go, and meteors, and so there was something dynamically going on in the sky. And of course, there might be cracks in the sky of ice too. But I for years I thought about, I got this great vision. What would be about that? And what's the story? Yeah, I'm still with it, but what's the story moment?
Maybe the cosmic background radiation that we look at is our sky device, but that is a great image and should be followed. And I'm going to end there, because we kind of do have to end with the suggestion of the moon of Saturn, which I think is Phoebe, but I'm actually a little bit lame on this, and that the name is slipping my mind. But it's the moon that is not in the same plane as the rings. It's about 17 degrees out, and that way, as you go around in your orbit, you get to see the rings, you get to see Saturn's North Pole, South Pole, and that's where I want to set my villa and have my... So, thank you, folks. Science fiction.